Welcome to the Political Risk Podcast, where geopolitics and insurance markets meet. You're listening to a new special episode produced in association with Lockton Re. Our theme is about strikes, riots and civil commotion. SRCC, the emerging portfolio peril. I'm your host, David Benyon. And to go through this hot topic and recurring subject, I'm glad to say we've got three recurring guests who are each returning to the pod. George Wragg is Senior Catastrophe Modeller at Lockton Re. Paul Upton is a consultant for Lockton Re. And Jerry Smith is Head of Advisory at Blackthorn. Now, strikes, riots, civil commotion, SRCC, has moved from the margins of property and political violence and terror portfolios into sharper focus for insurers and their reinsurers amidst the more volatile landscape for social unrest and geopolitical risk. Our conversation will follow a neat, simple structure in three parts. We will begin with Paul and Jerry providing an introduction to the peril, asking why does SRCC matter now? Then they will guide us further into the risk landscape facing insurers, their policyholders and of course their reinsurers around civil unrest, threat drivers and portfolio accumulations. Naturally, the issue of portfolio accumulation is core to things from a reinsurance broking perspective and risk transfer by treaty at book of business level. Then George joins our chat, providing his catastrophe modelling expertise and perspective for a deep dive into what's new and the state of play for modelling, data analytics and the reinsurance response. Paul will be the first of the three guests to speak. Okay, right, that's enough from me. Let's get into it. SRC is sat within insurers' broad property programs, or in some cases it's been bundled into political violence already, and we've seen events like Chile. Why is it becoming a more visible portfolio issue for insurers and for reinsurers?
Strikes, riots, civil commotions, all wrapped up in the key aspect of civil unrest. We're in a very volatile stage within global politics. I think that is a context that gives it a profile. In the insurers' minds, they've taken on some really significant exposures over the past decade or more. And it certainly sits within terror underwriters' portfolios as a very large exposure in some very interesting territories, which creates a profile for it. It's not taken the same profile as terror, S&T and PV. Certainly the PV world has dominated, I think, people's thoughts in Ukraine and more recently in Iran. But undoubtedly, the SRCC exposures are something that people need to maintain a good vigil. As I mentioned, the volumes of exposures on insurers' books are very large, and their ability to create realistic views of what the actual exposure is for any given scenario is very difficult to ascertain. What we call probable maximum loss scenarios is largely unproven in this particular sector, so that creates concerns. In the last 7 years, we've had some very big losses. You've mentioned there, Dave, Chile, we've had South Africa, and more recently, New Caledonia. But I guess one aspect of those particular losses is they've been very spotty in the sense of not being with the broad section of the market, but with a very few insurance carriers. And that, I guess, has created a little bit more confidence around the risk and perhaps created a bit more confidence than complacency, I guess, than probably needs to be. We've also seen with New Caledonia the fact that the property markets are taking up significant amounts of this exposure. And we'll come on to this a little bit later, but it does create a certain opaqueness when it's taken away from the terror markets and put into some of the property markets. And that creates a worry. But I think overall, the terror underwriters themselves are as much worried about the attritional aspect of SRCC exposures as they are from the large events. And they're particularly worried about it because over the past 3 years, the market has softened quite considerably. And the profile and the question mark around pricing adequacy has come to the fore. And it is attrition that really worries underwriters generally across multiple classes when we're thinking about pricing adequacy and trying to get our heads around really, how do we measure this? What data do we have? How can we take a very practical view as to what are the hallmarks of strikes, riots, civil commotions as an exposure? I've been involved with specialty reinsurance for many, many years and have been involved with Lockton Re for the past 6 years. We have a very large terror portfolio of business, and broadly speaking, there's sort of 3 different aspects to it, SRCC being one of those. And we've kept a very close eye on how people are measuring it and what steps they're taking to mitigate it, in other words, via hedging against reinsurance. And for us, we feel that there's some gaps in the marketplace knowledge, and we think that there's ways that we can start to close those gaps and help the insurance carriers to be able to measure the risk a lot better than they have been up until now.
Yeah, we'll get into the data and we'll get into the modelling, and that will be George's point to weigh in on the conversation. Jerry, though, I'll turn to you first, and give a little brief as to how your role relates to all of this. But from a threat advisory perspective, what would you say has changed in the civil unrest landscape since just in, let's say, the start of the decade? Paul's already mentioned some of those big events that we have seen around the globe. Yeah, what do they tell us about the nature of the peril?
Firstly, it's lovely to be here again. Good to see you. Well, so what we're still seeing in sort of advisory, there's 2 elements really. I think the first one is the strategic background. Paul's kind of mentioned it already. You know, we are in this multipolar world now. There's a lot more activism perhaps than there was a decade ago. Social media is very much an enhancer of that activism, and the sort of acceleration in tech as well. I just get this sort of sense, and this is very qualitative, I'm afraid, but there's more disruption, more
everything, I think.
More everything, yeah. Yeah, there's more disputes. There's just people are becoming, and people are becoming just more and more actively engaged in grievances. And, you talk about some in the picture, I mean, sort of pre-COVID, and Paul will know this better than me, is sort of the SRC single events. I mean, there was nothing anywhere near the sort of losses that we've seen since COVID, since post sort of 2019, 2020. Obviously, the BLM activity a few years ago was a number of sort of essentially not coordinated, but ended up appearing to be coordinated because of the communications that the activism sort of drove.
And that was social media, of course. It was across the US, and then it became international.
Yeah, absolutely. And France, in 2003, there was a killing of a youngster in France that drove certain levels of violence in Paris and other cities. And that was kind of on top of economic and pension reform grievances as well. But it's not, of course, just in the West. Kenya in 2024, there was sort of a Gen Z mobilization, cost of living triggers, that sort of thing, access and coordination, again, social media, Bangladesh, and as mentioned, New Caledonia. I mean, those sort of what we'd consider to be more out of the way geographies, I mean, coming from a very much a Western perspective, actually those accumulated losses just really did start to stack up. So the grievances are all sort of interacting with each other, fueled by media, globalization, everybody, and even in the more disadvantaged countries, social media and the internet is easily accessible by everybody. So everybody's seeing what everyone else is doing.
Paul, you already alluded to this, but I think there is a danger, right, of the market underestimating civil unrest as a peril.
Yeah, quite possibly. I mean, I would never suggest that insurers underestimate anything that they're putting on their books, but certainly strikes right civil commotions as a set of exposures, when it comes into the terror markets, at the very least, is heavily packaged. A lot of it is put together in worldwide slips. A lot of it's put together within brokers' line slips. We see a huge amount of exposure going into the property markets as part of broader property coverages. So it's a challenge identifying those exposures and knowing what to do with them. So I guess that when you think about the large losses we've had in the past few years, they have been large claims, but they've not been crippling claims to the marketplace. They've had a nasty effect on a small number of people. And I think perhaps, the way that the business is packaged might mean that people take their foot off the gas in terms of looking at the potential for those claims to really badly affect capital. It sort of validates, I guess, the way it's been packaged, because these package policies do create a nice volume of premium for underwriters in a broader sector where there's good margin to be made. It sort of means perhaps we don't look at this today, perhaps we look at this tomorrow. Yeah. The difficulty is, though, is the premium adequate? How's that being tested? How volatile is SRCC? Well, we think it's very volatile. We think it provides and can provide very high attritional claims when you think about the number of civil unrest incidents there are in the world and how that affects the insurance market. And they can be very severe as individual claims too.
You mentioned some of the previous events, and Chile is a good example, because during that event, those losses were mostly within the local insurer's property. It was only afterwards it was excluded and moved more to the dedicated PV space terror underwriters in Miami or in London. So the actual losses were mostly not absorbed by PV. So you do have that issue of it being perhaps local firms that, as you say, it's quite spotty in terms of who's been most hit by these things over the years. And South Africa is a very different example because of the SRCC government-backed arrangement, but still similar in that sense.
I mean, it's difficult to find out where the exposures are at any one time. They do ebb and flow between the property markets and the terror markets per se. And some of that is driven by the reinsurers excluding these types of coverages. So 2 years ago, there was some pretty high-profile reinsurers not wanting to give SRCC cover within property reinsurances, which meant that forced it more into the terror marketplace. And you're also right to bring up the point about government pools. I mean, we understand that the French are about to look at SRCC on that basis and bring that within a government pool, which would be an interesting move, and certainly relieve a bit of a headache from the insurers in terms of what those exposures are. Having said that, of course, it also stars them with the premiums that they would have otherwise been able to take out of France. So It's a double-edged sword.
Jerry, let's identify some future threat drivers, as many or as few as you like, but then having addressed them, look at which of those look perhaps most important over the next 12 to 18 months.
I mean, we've kind of covered some of this off, really, and it's really sort of, shall we say, stepping off on what we've already discussed. You know, that Generation Z, that tech-enabled mobilization is very much an amplifier. And I think amplifying the frequency, particularly, because it just means that there's that cohort. But you end up with, you know, different groups that 5, certainly 10 years ago, would not have communicated, would not really been aware of each other's issues. And the issues may not be shared, but if there's a grievance against their government, then there's potentially a piece of unity there. We've seen this with sort of the one-piece pirate flag. I mean, this is a non-adjacent countries with no obvious connections that are actually coalescing around particular issues. I think another element of that is around the AI generation of content, deep fakes, fabricated footage, protest imagery that may be taken. I mean, sometimes you've seen it attributed to one country in one location and it's actually been filmed in another location, or it's been faked up. So those amplification of frequency, I think, is certainly a concern.
Yeah, there's an awful lot of not necessarily a deep fake or anything, but a lot of disingenuous where social media activity comes from that stirs up potential civil unrest. And we saw with the beginning of the Iran conflict, there were an awful lot of social media accounts associated with, let's say, Scottish independence is one that I remember reading about, that was shut down overnight. Turns out they were controlled by Tehran. It makes you wonder how much more proportion were controlled by Moscow.
And perhaps you could even cast your net even wider as well in terms of hostile governments. And, you know, for some of that, that's just about making mischief. It doesn't have to be having a specific aim. They can outsource it as well. So you can get multiple whirlpools of activity going on, which all adds together and starts to sort of drive and motivate individuals to sort of become more active. And whether then, when you get this sort of critical mass of activity, that sort of starts to spill into more and more violence. I've got an old friend who's a senior police officer, and I was sort of speaking to him, UK policing we're talking about now, and there's kind of an identified critical mass of beyond which, if those certain section of the protesters reach this critical mass, then the chances of that developing into violence goes off the scale very, very quickly. And so, in fact, one of the whole policing techniques is actually observing where those particular players are and trying to stop them from coalescing into that critical mass, because that becomes, dare I say, infectious. And then people that aren't part of that, you know, that angry squad actually get confidence. So that involvement and developing of issue that could be quite benign, there's so much of that is not just about the drivers, but it's also actually how the law enforcement might respond to that. Now, we get to that to a quite extreme level when we see some of the deaths that occurred more recently in the US by the hands of law enforcement and federal agencies, and it becomes a cause célèbre. So that sort of disenfranchisement, that anti-democratic overreach, the state-level escalation, all of those things sort of mix into that as well. And if the perception that there is this sort of democratic deficit, we can see the rise of extreme parties, both on the left and right, that sort of manifests itself in another way. And obviously people voting and supporting parties is one approach, but another approach, of course, is activities that can take place. And I think you add that questioning of state legitimacy, economic hardships, and we've got this fertile ground. And the other thing I'd sort of add, and to sort of Paul's point, and jumping in and around the lines of business with property and SRCC, of course, we could add into the max of that the other elements of terror and PV as well, and where those sort of move across terrorists have been known to use riots, for example, in the past. So if they conduct activities, where is that consequence? Where's that going to sit if losses are generated? Is it a terror loss? Is it an SRCC loss? Is it a property loss? I mean, all of those things are really sort of opaque.
Staying with you for a moment then, Jerry, the US, there's an awful lot going on. Some of it, the World Cup's already underway, and 4th of July as well, just had. But there's also the midterms, the back end of the year. I'm aware it's very difficult to predict these things anyway, because as soon as you start saying, I remember last year everyone said there was going to be so many people going to the polls, it was almost certainly going to be an SRCC spike, and it actually wasn't quite what it was billed, but what happens when you try and chase black swans a bit too closely. But with quite a lot of things happening on in America at the moment, looking ahead to those midterms, but also the law enforcement issues you've already talked about, how law enforcement is deployed. We saw some unrest in California not that long ago. How should insurers think about that, and what could turn tensions into an SRCC loss event in the US?
Well, I think those where tensions are already elevated. So, the protest that is against the president, they're not new. They've been ongoing from his first term and also taking over, obviously, from when he started his second term as well. The No Kings mobilised 7 million people across the continent in 2,500 events in sort of October 2025. And those being replicated, we thankfully have not seen anything significant at all since the World Cup has started. One would imagine that certainly the law enforcement is probably really quite densely deployed in those locations where the events are taking place in the US. But certainly in terms of some of the federal deployments into conducting what states might consider to be the state business, you're starting to get then government against government discussions, or should we say disagreements. And that again is potentially sort of moving those issues in the states, which is kind of more US focused because of obviously the relationship between federal, state and county relationships there. We've kind of got a few triggers that might be worth sort of outlining, I suppose. The one is, as you kind of hinted there, is the election related. Federal forces at polling places. We've seen, so-called election monitors who could be quite parochial and actually, are they monitoring or are they trying to intimidate, those sort of things? And that could drive then counter disputes, that sort of things.
We've seen the independence of the whole electoral process called into question.
Yeah, I've got a good friend in the US who, he's a former military, and there's a whole the vote scheme, which is essentially veterans looking to deploy as election monitors, as being an honest broker within that, and not taking sides at all, but actually wanting to reduce the chance of election interference at all actually on the day. And then we get the movement of boundaries. We get the issues around postal voting. If individuals, if groups are feeling, communities are feeling that they're becoming disenfranchised and that the democratic process is ceasing to operate for them. And obviously in the US, because of the all-pervasive concepts of society and freedom and that, if those elements are being perceived to be or genuinely being eroded, then clearly that's something I think that's particularly concerning in the country. I mean, the targeting of political violence as well, we've obviously seen some dreadful murders, Charlie Kirk amongst others. And whilst that's not a rioting, it clearly could end up driving some. We certainly saw some protests in support and against him. And it would only take, again, some more targeted issues within the political realm.
Well, there was a stadium-level commemoration event after that assassination as well, with the president attending, I think, as well as his widow.
So all potential hotspots, and that's just in the US itself. You then look at the current situation, obviously, in the Middle East, and I mean, I don't know what day this is going to go out. So
things are changeable.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the ebb and flow of the situation and relationship that we have between Iran and
I think
Israel
people
and
are
the US.
past judging you too strongly based on events turning in the Middle East.
Yeah. But of course, there is still blowback from that. So even whilst the US might have near energy independence, global pricing doesn't work like that way. So actually those actions are still having an impact at the gas station. So those economic tail events as well potentially could generate it. So the US is a particular situation. It's not unique, but it certainly has its own little foibles.
Paul, again, we've already alluded to this in passing, but SRCC is a bit of a messy peril in the sense that it doesn't all sit in one place. So let's just address that full on through one question. So give us a kind of wide-ranging where this sits within insurer portfolios, looking at property, PV, terror, or some combination of all of those, and what that means for accumulation risk, and then obviously discussions with reinsurers.
We suspect that SRCC values embedded in the property market probably dwarf the values in the terror market. And the one thing that sort of we rely on making that statement is that we can see that within the terror market, the broader S&T values in areas like workers' comp, even fine art, and definitely property. We can look at the aggregations in blast zones around those, and they are way bigger than the terror market. So to think about this just as an issue for terror is entirely wrong. It's a broader issue. And given that the market over the past 20 years has moved towards a much more diversified business model, that creates a real headache for the markets. And we know that the reinsurance capacity that's available out there to try and deal with some of these exposure numbers is nowhere near big enough. So the opportunity for broader corporations to hedge against this accumulation across different classes of business is highly, highly limited. So it's a difficulty for everyone.
It's a bit like the silent cyber conversation, isn't it? Because that was based around there being unintended or unwanted cyber exposure within other liability business, not intended. The parallel I want to draw is obviously if you're a PV underwriter and that's your focus, then you're going to ask the right questions and you'd expect to have more of a handle on these perils within what you're underwriting. But as a property underwriter, wherever that may be, and all risks, those are not people who are focused on SRCC or malicious risk perils, and therefore they're probably not even asking the right questions. It will get to the data side of it, but hence why there's that opacity about quite how much there is and not having much confidence about a firm number on it.
It's a really difficult issue. A property cover is a property cover, doesn't it? And it covers everything from elemental perils to non-elemental perils. And within non-elemental perils lies SRCC, which could be a real issue for them. And that was one of the things that a small number of very large corporations faced with the New Caledonia loss, because that came through their property portfolio, not through their terror portfolios. It's a real issue. But the broader issue, I think, and you know, George will come on to this, really, is what data are you getting and how are you looking at this? And I think when we think about, you know, the question you just asked, Jerry, from the US perspective, the US data broadly, any class of business tends to be, you know, of a better quality than the rest. But even there, we're finding that, you know, we're not getting the granularity that is needed to try and bring the models on to be able to create the answers that the insurers need to make the right calculations for their insurances.
An awkward question, awkward for the insurance market in general, business interruption and continued business interruption. It probably needs to be addressed as part of this discussion. Again, I'm thinking of events like Chile, because it went on for months and months and months, and there was inevitable disruption. Wouldn't necessarily matter if your shop had been set fire to or something along those lines. It was probably just inaccessible and your staff couldn't maybe reach the business or whatever. And then, of course, you get second order and third order if it's not a shop, it's a warehouse, it's a supply chain issue, and then other businesses are affected and it becomes more CBI. So what's the reality there in terms of coverage and exclusions, and how material could BI or CBI be in prolonged unrest events like I just described? Yeah, why they're so tricky to capture at portfolio level.
Yeah, another layer of complexity on an already complex issue. So quite often BI will overshadow even the PD loss, and that's commonplace. When we're thinking about SRCC, we are thinking about people trying to make an impact. They're trying to say something, so they tend to go after businesses. You know, they might firebomb the odd house and set a bus on fire, but what they really want to do is hurt businesses, because that's the nature of the beast. So business interruption is a massive part of that, and a business interruption will be, as I say, very much bigger than the physical loss or damage claim that comes upon it. In the hard market, insurance carriers have a good deal of success in terms of limiting the exposure, and they do that through putting broader retention levels in, the higher retention levels, and limiting the amount of values involved. For CBI, for contingent business interruption, they can even exclude that in a hard market. When we get into a soft market, which I would suggest we've been in for the past 2 years, that tends to go out the window. So CBI will be becoming a bigger issue in terms of insurance carriers' view, and the business interruption is already a problem. So it's not easy to get their hands around it. The biggest issue in terms of trying to work out what it really means to evaluate the risk is getting hold of the data. And that is because we're dealing here with supply chains, and we're dealing with third-party providers. And when a third-party provider is not party to the insurance contract in the first place, they have less of a duty to be able to provide the data that the people need. So if that could ever be unwound, if there's any way that the insurers can actually find out more about the data around the supply chain, then we stand a better chance of understanding what BI and CBI threat looks like.
Okay, so we're on to I think the really most interesting part of our conversation now, which is to talk about modelling, data, and how the reinsurance sector can respond to the challenges. So, George, you kept your powder dry. Let's focus on the modelling challenges, because SRCC is just so difficult to get our hands around the data. What is the current state of SRCC modelling?
I guess rather than saying the current state, I guess it's good to say what we've previously done or what I've done in the role since I've been in Lockton. I guess most companies or most clients kind of ask us to do it more fits under exposure management rather than modelling, where we're basically just, trying to find where peak exposure sits within some arbitrary boundary, whether it's a country, city, or certain region, and basically seeing how the accounts split within that, and then applying some sort of PML curve based on some risk scores. And these risk scores, can come from multiple third-party providers, and they're often generated in different ways. I guess the problem is that's a very simplified approach, because you're applying a flat factor to exposure across quite a wide region, rather than applying some realistic disaster scenarios along with frequency and severity. But that's typically what we've been doing. But as obviously the guys have mentioned, since losses have increased, geopolitics has become more, strained, let's say, there has been more interest in improving this. And I think there is a movement in the market to improve. I mean, there's a couple of companies out there. I mean, Verisk have just released recently their US catastrophe model, which is attempting to apply frequency severity to realistic scenarios to kind of produce sort of realistic PML curves, rather than just applying sort of some flat factor to large exposures, basically. And sort of not similar, but, going down sort of improving analytics. We have Synthetic, who are sort of creating deterministic events that represent sort of black swan events that can happen, basically. And how they do that is by sort of running thousands of events between, certain vulnerable targets, I guess, to come up with what is your peak exposure, which is what we do for the terror market, where we're running sort of RDS scenarios or certain accumulations. So to me, that's a much better way of looking at it, rather than, applying flat factor PMLs based on risk scores that can change between, depending on what vendor you look at.
It is just so immature as an area of modelling compared to established cat models and property. I guess it's how we go about changing that.
I mean, there's a reason why it's behind. Is obviously losses from the nat cat world have been large, and everyone knows them. And I guess it's more the complexity in modelling SRCC. Obviously, SRCC losses are driven by human behaviour, which are much harder to predict and to model. But also the hazard itself is also human derived. So rather than when we look at terror, it's a human caused event, but there's physical processes around a bomb blast that you can get your head around. Whereas SRCC, it's the cause and the loss is human derived. So yeah, it's difficult. And obviously these political and social conditions can change so rapidly. And the escalation pathways are so complex. Whether a protest remains peaceful or escalates depends on so many factors, so many moving parts that often are unknown or are derived from different actors, I guess. And also, like, these model developments are pushed by sort of major loss scenarios. So the terror market has developed following, major loss events throughout the years. And obviously, NatCat is always pushed by that. So as major losses happen in the SRCC space, there'll be more drive for companies to sort of invest in this space. And I would expect that would happen, especially as data improves.
So, George, another question for you, but perhaps Paul could come in on this one too, and Jerry if he wants to. What data would reinsurers like to see being collected to improve SRCC analysis? And how far away is the market from collecting those kind of things with any consistency?
The biggest factor by far to me is geocoding quality. I mean, this isn't just an SRCC problem. This is a property and terror problem. Especially, I'd say for SRCC, it's highlighted because these regions are often away from the typical high data quality standards regions, such as the US, I guess, and Europe. If we're looking at Latin America, Caribbean, sort of Africa, MENA, the data quality just isn't there. As in, from a geocoding perspective, we don't even know where the property lies. So doing more fine-grained analytics, such as using deterministic events or applying a cat model, the uncertainty is much higher because we just don't know where they are. So even from the first point, our exposure aggregation is wrong, rather than before we even apply some sort of severity and frequency. I think that is improving as we go forward. Data capture is getting better, but to be able to take full advantage of any advances in modelling, that needs to improve as the first principle, basically. And on top of that, occupancy or land use is so important. Whether it's a downstream site or it's a restaurant or pharmaceutical company, the vulnerability of those varies drastically from an SRCC event, and also the proximity to those as well. So those should be captured. Those often aren't given, but it might not be because they don't have them. It might be because they're just not educated on how that could be used, I guess. So yeah, that's a route that needs to be improved.
Clearly, we've already got a US model on the market for it, but SRCC is going to be a peril that will affect places that have a complete lack or paucity of data in comparison to the US.
There's definitely a push to try and extend the logic that's being applied to the US to elsewhere. I guess the logic needs to be able to take into account uncertainties and assumptions, and as the data quality reduces, those assumptions will get bigger. Therefore, the true value of risk will not be assessed properly. But yeah, you're right in the sense that the US is the gold standard for data quality, and that's probably the first place to start. But I think that just gives more incentive to improve the data quality elsewhere, to take advantage of whatever comes out from the US in terms of modelling.
Well, it's a logical place to start, yeah.
But I mean, the modelers are raring to go with this, aren't they, in a sense? They sort of know what the approach is, I think. They just need the data to be able to fulfill it, because at the moment there's a lot of talk about a number of different ways of modelling. And with SRCC, of course, unlike terror, it tends to have a moving risk. It doesn't stay in one place. You get the hordes moving around at different locations and trying to work that out. And a number of people are approaching that. So there's a lot of very interesting modelling that could be done, but we're just so short on that data that it makes it very difficult to see how we're going to make progress. So the second part of your question, which is, how far away are we from this? It's sort of anyone's guess, I get, George, isn't it? I mean, I can't see that we've seen much progress. There was a flurry of models that seemed to come out about a year or two ago, and I'm not really seeing an awful lot of progress from there since.
Yeah, I think until we're able to have sort of a wider approach to other regions, I think, that's where the improvement needs to happen, is data quality there, I'd say.
If SRCC is increasingly be transferred to the reinsurance market on a portfolio basis, what should the industry do next? We talked a lot about the challenges, and clearly you can't do everything at once. What's easiest? What should we address first? Is it RDS assumptions? I mean, that Jerry's worked on RDS before. Improving data standards, whichever route you go to try and achieve that. Or is it about bringing threat intelligence more directly into portfolio management, developing new modelling tools? Yeah, what's the logical focus, or what should we do first?
Well, I think to begin with, I'd challenge the assumption you just made, which is it's being transferred into the reinsurance market, because I'm not so sure that's the case. Most insurance buyers tend to use excess of loss non-proportional treaties to hedge their risk. And so since South Africa, the introduction of event definitions has meant that insurers are finding it very difficult to just stack their exposures and their losses in one vertical loss to put into those reinsurance programs. And I think that I would suggest actually that the insurers are holding a lot of exposure to SRCC because of those event definitions and because of the extent of the retentions on the treaty reinsurance programs. So it is a real issue, I believe. And one of the things about, why are we pressing so hard to try and get the modelling more accurate is because if you don't get proper informed data around the OEP and AEP outputs, you can't possibly really understand what type of reinsurance you're going to need. And the obvious thing to say here is that proportionate treaty probably deals with this in a much better way, but quota shares, whilst there's a few more of them than there were, are not the weapon of choice when people buy their insurances. And that's why I think SRC is a particular issue here. I mean, when we talked about the Beyond the Blast podcast and white paper that we put together, we were really sort of accentuating the need for insurers to invest in better data capture because we hypothesized that a lot of capital was being wasted in overinflated event modelling. In this, with the SRCC, we're sort of saying you're not buying enough insurance and it's not in the right place. So it's a slightly different view to the S&T paper. However, the issues still come back to the same thing, which is where do we get this data from to create a better informed framework from which to make the right decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of going to repeat some of the same points that Paul said, but it's the data standards need to improve, basically. Like, we need more data, we need more information on where it is, the coverage split, etc. That is mainly so you're able to take the new models or the improved analytics coming out of these modeling companies in the future, especially for the regions that we care about that are typically, not as well monitored.
From the advisory side, signals worth tracking really is understanding that sort of frequency level. I completely concur with the requirement for data. But in terms of understanding how the modelers are trying to capture that information around frequency, and that's going to be certainly a focus that we're looking at, is a dynamic and moving part. And I think one of the challenges of that is that, as you kind of pointed out, the relative maturity of the US versus others, that if carriers are looking at a universal solution, that is posing even a higher bar for modelers to try and achieve. So I think it's going to have to be an incremental approach of what we try and achieve, and you're not going to be able to get the ideal right from the get-go, because that idea of universality is a real challenge. I mean, US cities tend to be gridded, for example, if you're looking at modeling of SRCC. It is the most simplistic of cities. You go outside the US and you're into levels of complexity again, which is more of an issue there. I think the only other thing is worth considering again, and it's sort of aligned to this sort of regional differences that are challenges, is in the SRC space, unlike a terror attack, which takes place and then everything is sort of after the event, generally the way that SRCC events occur, there's a level of time where the law enforcement will get involved and actually trying to model what that law enforcement response might be. And we see differences even within Europe of some countries that might, shall we say, take a slightly more robust approach to policing to others. But even then, the city geography, layout, and simply something like a river running through a city can have some massive impacts on how an SRCC event might end up. So trying to model those nuances simply isn't easy. And I think my plea to the carriers is being open to alternative approaches of modeling, because trying to just replicate how terror is modeled, which in itself, as we did Beyond the Blast, is have some challenges and potential areas of improvement. This is I would suggest, is a level above in terms of complexity.
And that rounds off this special episode of the Political Risk Podcast, produced in association with Lockton Re. I'd really like to thank my three great expert guests for this insight-packed special: Paul Upton and George Wragg from Lockton Re, and Jerry Smith from Blackthorn. So until next time, thank you for listening, and please tune in again. I've been your host, David Benyon. Production was by Peter McGill, and Lawrence Durkin made the music.